The topic obviously is confronting the backlash against the anti-racist uprising. And I just want to start by saying, from the vantage of today, it's very difficult to actually almost remember or put ourselves in time and place of what it was like to be in a context where people were openly talking about abolition versus where we are today. And so I want to start by sort of taking us back to the rebellion and what that looked like, because it is kind of incredible, even if you've been a radical for many years, to kind of experience that and remember what that was like. So back in 2020, some 15 to 20 million people participated in the largest anti-racist protests in history in a sustained national rebellion that inspired international solidarity and threw the entire criminal legal system on the defensive. In New York City alone, 47 police cars were damaged or burned within the first 2 weeks of the uprising. Police had arrested more than 17,000 people across the country, the largest such wave of arrests since the Vietnam War. And in Washington, D.C., protests outside the White House temporarily forced Trump to flee to his bunker, allegedly to inspect it and not in abject fear of the riots. And this all occurred in defiance of curfews and stay in place orders imposed by mayors and governors in every major city. The struggles were led primarily by Black youth, but the consciousness, participation, and solidarity they generated extended to non-Black people, including in rural, majority white regions and even former sundown towns. At the height of the protest, an astounding 54% of Americans felt that the burning of a police station in Minneapolis was either justified or partially justified. And in exit polls for the November elections, voters cited racial injustice as the second most important issue facing the country after the economy. Yet these protests were not just about police brutality. They are also a reaction to the failure of state and federal governments to respond to the horrific death toll and economic devastation caused by a world historic pandemic, and resistance to the multi-pronged wave of attacks on oppressed and working class people from the Trump administration on down. We saw this in the evolution of the Black Lives Matter protests between 2014 and 2020, as a whole layer of activists who began with demands for more Black police officers and body cameras came out 6 years later as committed abolitionists, saying we needed to dismantle the whole thing. The protest popularized connections between racial and economic injustice, as evidenced by the social and economic priorities that require billions in funding for police at the expense of all other life-giving resources and social services. And they came to define abolition not just as the absence of police, but as the presence of a society where everyone has everything they need to thrive. The opening for connecting that struggle to the struggle for socialism should be obvious. Obviously, a society based on social need and not profit. But despite that potential, the left by and large missed the opportunity to build mass organizations at the height of these struggles or in their aftermath to push the movements as far as they could go. There are a number of reasons for this, but I think importantly, they include divisions on the left around how to understand the nature of anti-racist struggle. Fast forward to the present, and aside from notable exceptions like the ongoing battle to stop the building of Cop City in Atlanta, mass protests have largely receded from the streets. Instead, the widespread opposition to policing that the movement had forced into mainstream conversation has been largely replaced by a crime wave narrative. This continues a trend of the last 4 decades during which police budgets have skyrocketed, whether crime rates were rising or falling, as the flip side of imposing austerity budgets. So, for example, in New York City, where I am, former cop Mayor Eric Adams is waging a war on houseless and mentally ill people on the subway. And more recently, he's added scapegoating migrants to that list in tandem with massive budget cuts. Meanwhile, the NYPD's budget grew to $11 billion, making it the largest police budget in the entire country. But while homicides did spike during the pandemic, violent crime in New York remains at historic lows overall and has dropped by an additional 5.6% in recent months, even according to the NYPD's own statistics. They'll claim credit for it, of course, but we know that's not true. The city's murder rate was 5 times higher during the 80s and 90s than it is today. Even for cities like Chicago, LA, and DC, where rates of deadly gun violence reached their highest point in a decade, other violent crimes actually decreased nationally during the pandemic. But the new frightening atmosphere produced by the backlash was encapsulated in the earlier part of this year in New York following the murder of Jordan Neely, an unarmed, unhoused Black man who was choked to death by another passenger on the subway. Neely's murder reflects the extent to which the ruling class has succeeded in reinforcing public fears about crime and the idea that more police are necessary to address it, something that both Republicans and Democrats agree on, regardless of their differences. On the right, Republican legislation from the top down comes in tandem with open white supremacists willing to intimidate and enact extra legal violence on the ground. Armed far-right groups like the Oath Keepers or the Three Percenters came to at least 100 of the summer 2020 Black Lives Matter protests, often with the tacit or explicit support of the police. Since May 2020, at least 4 states have expanded the definitions of penalties for rioting. At least 8 states have created or enhanced penalties for protesters who obstruct streets, sidewalks, or gas and oil pipelines, along with bills that literally allow cars to run over protesters. Only in this country, my God. In 2021 and 2022, federal, state, and local government officials introduced 563 anti-critical race theory measures, of which 241 have been enacted. But the Democratic Party is also complicit in this backlash. The same politicians who say Black Lives Matter are actively leading the charge against the central demand of the movement to defund the police. In fact, it has largely been Democrats at both the federal level and in major urban centers who have pursued racist law and order policies, with police as the first line of defense, especially as ongoing economic instability has prompted city officials to embrace austerity, which in turn will require more police to control the fallout. Arguably, Biden, who was elected in the wake of the uprising, was the primary beneficiary of the movement in the absence of a truly left-wing alternative to Trump. Yet Biden not only vehemently opposed defunding the police, he called for increased funding for police departments, which at the time of his presidential campaign already received a combined annual $115 billion. This was nothing new. Biden's long record of bolstering policies such as the 1994 crime bill produced the greatest expansion of policing in prisons, and in turn increased contact between those living in segregated, predominantly Black neighborhoods and the armed forces of the state. Black people remain 3 times more likely to be killed in a police encounter than white people, regardless of whether they are unarmed, had called the police for help, or were merely existing in their own homes, as what happened to Sandra Bland. What happened to Breonna Taylor. Sorry, there is such a long list, as we all know. Unlike Republicans, the Democrats pay lip service to the movement while leaving the means of death and destruction of Black life fully intact. Biden's 2021 plan for criminal justice reform mimicked Obama's 21st century task force on policing in its focus on improving so-called community police relations. Meanwhile, other Democrats' proposals to address police misconduct, like the 2021 George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, merely recycled some of the same meager policy changes like body cameras, diversity training, chokehold bans, things that had already been implemented and failed to stop police brutality in Minneapolis, meaning the act named for George Floyd would have not even saved his own life. Ultimately, as Naomi Murakawa notes, quote, unflagging Democratic support for police sharpens the blade for Republican spearheaded criminalization of dissent, reproductive autonomy, and gender-affirming healthcare. In other words, the consequences of the backlash impact more than just protests against police racism. They facilitate the rollback of the rights of queer and trans folks, abortion rights, and reproductive justice, and are aimed at hampering our resistance. And we've seen that most recently, of course, in the major police apparatus that exists to survey mosques in a callback to 9/11 and to crack down on protests in solidarity with Palestine. This points to the necessity of building an anti-racist struggle that is both independent of the two capitalist parties and clear about the challenges we're up against. But it also matters that the left understand what it will take to resist this multi-pronged backlash against workers and the oppressed. And that requires clarity from the beginning on the nature of racism, the struggle for socialism, and the strategies that flow from this. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Phil.
So in my comments, I mean, my basic argument is going to be that to try to understand racism without class, or to analyze class oppression without race, is really to misunderstand both of these forms of exploitation and oppression. Now, in the US, we're very familiar with attempts to address racism without a class perspective, because that's the approach of the liberal establishment in politics, the business world, the mainstream media, education, and so on. So in the immediate aftermath of the police killing of George Floyd in 2020, suddenly almost everyone claimed to be an anti-racist. I mean, Amazon, Nike, Walmart, they all put out statements opposing racism. Ben and Jerry's said, we must dismantle white supremacy. Silence is not an option. But the actions that went along with these announcements amounted to very little. Training programs for their employees, perhaps some money towards scholarships and education, an effort to get a few more people of color into management positions or into the boardroom. Colleges and universities also declared themselves to be anti-racist. The Chronicle of Higher Education in the summer of 2020 declared that this may be a watershed moment in the history of higher education and race. Now, I wish that was true, but once again, the actions that went along with statements like this amounted to very little. So if you take a diversity training in higher education, which is what I'm most familiar with, the focus is almost invariably on individuals and their ideas. So there'll be plenty of discussion of unconscious bias, which is real, microaggressions, which are also real, white privilege, which is certainly real, but probably no discussion of the class interests that racism serves, or how to take collective action to challenge those interests. So that's approaching racism while ignoring class. But on the US left, we sometimes see the reverse phenomenon, a focus on class that downplays the significance of race. One person who's taken this position is the left-wing academic Adolph Reed. Now, Adolph Reed is a distinguished African-American political science. He's often had valuable things to say. He's written a lot of books and articles, but he's always relished being a contrarian. And I think that he and a number of people influenced by him have gone badly off the rails in their writings about race and class. They start from the same place that I would start from, that we need a class analysis of racism. But from that, they go to a series of badly mistaken conclusions. First, they argue that if we have a class analysis, then we can explain racial inequality mainly in terms of class inequality and pay less attention to race. So one striking example of this was an article in Catalyst, which is Jacobin's sort of theoretical journal, a few years ago by John Clegg and Adana Usmani, which argued that mass incarceration isn't a product of racism. Reed himself published an article in 2020 arguing that racial inequality in health outcomes is due to underlying class inequalities, and that even to draw attention to the fact that Blacks have it worse will simply open the door to racist pseudoscience, which tries to explain Black-white differences in biological terms. So that's part of their position. Secondly, Reed and his co-thinkers conclude from this that socialists should focus on universal demands, things like raising the minimum wage or Medicare for all, not on specifically anti-racist demands. So Reed, for instance, was hostile to the Black Lives Matter movement and to the call for reparations. He's even argued that anti-racism is productive. According to Reed, this is a quote, because racism is not the principal source of inequality today, anti-racism functions more as a misdirection that justifies inequality than a strategy for eliminating it. Elsewhere, he says that anti-racism gives cover to neoliberal identity politics, which elevates a few blacks, women, gays, etc., to prominent positions, but which doesn't challenge underlying inequalities. Now, Reed's critics accuse him of class reductionism. He doesn't like that term, but I think it fits. He, in turn, accuses his critics of being race reductionists, trying to explain everything in terms of racism. But maybe there are some people who count as race reductionists, but that's not the position of most of Reed's left-wing critics. We critics agree that we need a class perspective, but we think that race and class are intertwined in a much more complex way than Reed allows. So to explain what those, the ways in which race and class have been intertwined in, particularly in the US, we have to discuss the history of capitalism and its relationship to racism. So my view is that capitalism created racism. That's actually a controversial view. Not everyone on the left, certainly not in the mainstream, agrees with that. And I can't give a detailed defense of it in a few minutes. But I'll point to one important piece of evidence in its favor. The concept of race didn't exist before the late 14th century. You don't find it in any ancient writings. It's not even in Marco Polo's diaries, which were written in the 13th century. And its emergence coincides with a wave of European colonial expansion that began in the 15th century and with the start of the modern African slave trade. And it was used, of course, to justify both of those. The Black historian Eric Williams argued in his classic study, Capitalism and Slavery, that racism doesn't explain slavery. Slavery explains racism. The slave trade was vital to the development of capitalism. In the 16th century, enslaved Africans were used to extract wealth from the New World that was essential to the primitive accumulation of capital in Western Europe. So racism was absolutely central to the regime of labor relations that allowed capitalism to develop. But it also played a variety of other key roles. Almost immediately, ruling elites recognized its value as a divide and rule strategy. In capitalism, like all class societies, a minority monopolizes most wealth and power. How can a small minority maintain its dominance over the vast majority? It will use open repression whenever necessary, but it's hard to run a society just on repression. So ruling classes need to find ways to stop the majority from organizing together. And racism has played this role, especially in North America, since at least the 17th century. Starting with Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia in 1676, there were significant uprisings in the American colonies, with poor whites and enslaved blacks often joining forces to fight against their masters. Ruling elites responded by passing slave codes to discipline blacks while giving small privileges to poor whites. According to the historian Theodore Allen, this amounted to the invention of the white race. Allen conducted a detailed survey of 17th century records and concluded, I have found no instance of the official use of the word white as a token of social status before its appearance in a Virginia law passed in 1691. Soon afterwards, the Virginia Assembly proclaimed that all white men were superior to blacks and passed a law requiring masters to provide white servants whose indenture time was up with money, supplies, and land. Such measures kept poor whites, as well as blacks, subordinated to their masters. As Frederick Douglass later put it, they divided both to conquer each. This is why racism survived the end of slavery and persisted both as a method of justifying continued racial inequality, embedded in the labor market, housing, education, healthcare, in every other area of society, and is the most effective divide and conquer strategy available to the ruling class. And racism also continued to play an important role in the justifications offered for colonial and imperial wars and conquest, which remain another central feature of capitalism. This raises an important question. Could capitalism exist without racism? I think that question can be approached in two ways. First, racism is thoroughly embedded and integrated in the capitalism we actually have. In order to end racism, we would have to dismantle the economic system that it is part of, not least because ending racism will require an enormous redistribution of wealth and power. Second, at a more abstract level, we can ask whether in different historical circumstances, capitalism could have emerged without racism. I'm willing to entertain that possibility. However, and this is a big however, I don't believe that capitalism could have emerged without some other functionally equivalent brutal system of oppression. Capitalism is a system of economic exploitation, but it's a system that can't operate without methods of dividing the mass of the population using harsh systems of oppression. And of course, in our society, race is not the only basis for oppression. We have sexism, homophobia, nationalism, ableism, and many other forms of oppression. So perhaps capitalism without racism is a theoretical possibility, but capitalism without oppression is not. So what practical conclusions should we draw? Because capitalism and racism are intertwined, and because of the role that racism plays in dividing the working class, if we want to fight against capitalism and class inequality, anti-racism has to be at the center of our activity. It's not enough, as Reed and his supporters propose, to raise universal class demands. One of the things that makes it difficult to win such demands is racism. For example, one of the reasons why social benefits are so much worse in the United States than in other developed capitalist countries is because racism is so strong here. The standard way of opposing government programs to provide welfare or healthcare is to portray them as handouts to undeserving people of color. Even though most whites would benefit enormously from such programs, this trick has been enormously effective. So there's absolutely no reason to see anti-racist struggles as a diversion. They are vital if we want to build the kind of class unity necessary to take on the whole system. But it's worth adding that the barriers that we have to overcome are not easy to overcome. Even though the argument that I'm making is that it's really not in the material interests of workers of whatever race to hold racist ideas, that doesn't mean it's easy to break down those ideas. The great African-American historian W.E.B. Du Bois talked about the psychological wage that racism provides to poor whites. It makes them feel superior, even if it is of no real material benefit to them, and that can be a very hard thing to break down. I mean, so I think we see a lot of that in US society today. But that doesn't mean it's impossible to break down these ideas. Racist ideas can be broken down, and the most obvious time that this happens is in periods of heightened struggle. So we have a kind of chicken and egg situation here, because racism acts as a way of dividing and making unified struggle more difficult. But if that unified struggle can take off, even in complicated, fragmented ways to begin with, it offers the possibility of fighting back against and breaking down the racial divisions. It's also worth adding that there's no sharp boundary between struggles for racial justice and fights for broader class demands. The experience and victories of struggles against racism can and often have laid the basis for fighting class exploitation. So just to mention one example, many of the militants who led the upsurge in labor militancy at the end of the 1960s One example is the successful postal workers' national wildcat strike in 1970, in which the leadership was predominantly people of color and also women. And many of these people, I bet 99% of them were veterans of the civil rights movement and the Black liberation struggle, and also the anti-war movement, the women's movement, the gay liberation movement, and so on. And that experience of fighting against those forms of oppression gave them the experience to lead one of the most important labor struggles of the a little over 50 years ago now, but of the last half century. So fighting racism and other forms of oppression strengthened the class struggle. If that's right, then the fight against racism is not a diversion or an optional extra. It's a vital and central part of the fight against class oppression and for socialism.
So, Phil has taken us through why a Marxist approach requires that socialists understand anti racism as essential to the fight against capitalism. And, I just wanted to say a word because while it's true that liberals reduce racism to a problem of bad ideas and ignorant individuals, and they don't address structural racism or the class power that racism serves to perpetuate, it's also true that the far right is gaining a hearing today by blaming the real decimation of living standards on Black people, immigrants, women, queer, and trans people. And so it lets corporations and the politicians responsible for those conditions off the hook. And I just want to quote from a 2020 survey of Republicans, where a slim majority agreed with statements like, quote, the traditional American way of life is disappearing so fast that we may have to use force to save it. Another discrimination against whites is as big a problem today as discrimination against Blacks and other minorities. Things have changed so much that I often feel like a stranger in my own country. Speaking English is essential for being a true American, and Black people need to stop using racism as an excuse. So, any alternative the left presents needs to be able to challenge both the ideological racism and the racist institutions like the criminal legal system that create the material basis for those ideas to gain a hearing. Because it's far easier for vigilantes to feel justified in gunning down Black people, as happened this summer in Jacksonville, Florida, where three Black people were killed by a white supremacist, or in the stabbing of O'Shea Sibley, a Black gay man in Brooklyn, New York, who was killed, when this already happens legally at the hands of police and the criminal system on a regular basis. Simply put, uniting a working class that is structurally divided by racism requires fighting racism wherever it appears, along with every other form of oppression. And because racism is so central to maintaining class inequality, resistance to racism, particularly anti-Black racism, tends to throw up bigger questions about the unequal nature of our entire society, not just for Black people, but for everyone. The key question is what the left can do to facilitate the process of building and rebuilding democratic, accessible institutions of resistance that are clear about the centrality of anti-racist struggle, not if, but when the next rebellion comes. Because the movement is on the defensive today, but we know that all of the conditions that led to the Black Lives Matter movement and the 2020 uprising in the first place have not been resolved. And so figuring out exactly what we need to do next is not an easy task. I'm not here to say I have all the answers, and I'm sure this discussion will be generative in figuring some of that out. But I do think that history offers some useful guides for how radicals have successfully forged unity within the working class, not by neglecting or downplaying racism, but by actively confronting it. So I want to offer a couple of examples. Phil gave one earlier in terms of the labor struggles of the 1960s. I want to give another of the Communist Party, the Scottsboro Boys, and the CIO during the 1930s. So in 1931, in Alabama, 9 Black boys were falsely accused of raping 2 white women. All except the youngest, who was 13, were sentenced to death by an all-white jury. The Communist Party reached out to their families and organized their legal defense alongside a national campaign to free the boys, which ultimately mobilized thousands of protesters, black and white, around the country and internationally to stop their execution, while also exposing the broader racism of the US legal system. The pressure of this mass grassroots campaign from below ultimately led the Supreme Court to overrule the boys' death sentences. Although the campaign was not able to win the boys' release from prison, it did succeed in saving their lives. As a result, the CP recruited a slew of Black comrades who were leading struggles in their own communities and gained such a strong reputation as among the most committed opponents of segregation, particularly among Black working class and agricultural workers, that the families of the boys spoke out against red baiting and other efforts by more moderate civil rights groups like the NAACP to distance themselves from the campaigns, or rather to break the campaign from its roots within the Communist Party. So to quote Janie Patterson, the mother of one of the boys, quote, I don't care whether they are reds, greens, or blues. They are the only ones who put up a fight to save these boys, and I am with them to the end quote. Throughout the Great Depression, the CP further solidified this reputation when workers who were members of the party or who were influenced by its organizing formed the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. Whereas the American Federation of Labor had been unwilling to challenge segregated locals or racist wage differentials, the CIO made a priority of organizing Black workers on the basis of industrial unionism, regardless of job, unskilled and skilled workers, Black and white in the same union, with Black organizers, some of whom were party members, leading the charge. Working together with the National Negro Congress, a CP-led organization allied with civil rights organizations, the union was able to undercut reluctance or hostility among Black people toward unions, given their prior experience facing exclusion or even violence when they attempted to organize themselves. They also challenged white workers' racism under the slogan, Black and white unite and fight. As a result of this, and through the experience of successful strikes, in which Ford Motors, for instance, proved unable to play on racial divisions by using Black workers as strike breakers, the number of Black workers in unions grew from 56,000 in 1930 to 1.25 million by 1945. This strong link between the CP and anti-racist struggles was broken before the start of the civil rights movement in response to Stalin's Popular Front policy, during which the party abruptly shifted away from criticizing the US or capitalism. This undermined the party's commitment to fighting racism and left Black allies of the party feeling that their needs had been subordinated to Soviet foreign policy interests. Nevertheless, communists had become so closely associated with anti-racist activism that during the Red Scare, McCarthyites frequently attacked anti-racists by accusing them of being communists. The purging of communists from the labor movement and the capitulation of some labor leaders to Cold War politics meant removing some of the most committed opponents of racism from the AFL-CIO, and its efforts to enforce desegregation declined. Meanwhile, middle-class Black organizations who cooperated with Cold War anti-communism did not actually succeed in protecting themselves from racist attacks. In fact, the NAACP's literature was banned, along with the actual communists. In a scathing indictment, left historian Manning Marable concludes that, quote, by serving as the left wing of McCarthyism, middle-class Negro leaders retarded the Black movement for a decade or more. So a pretty strong indictment. I wanted to give another example from the 60s. The civil rights movement began as a struggle for equal rights, predicated on the dismantling of this country's Jim Crow system of racial apartheid in the South. Polls throughout the 60s did not show a ready-made multiracial coalition behind Black demands for civil rights. A 1963 Gallup poll found that 78% of white people would leave if Black families moved into their neighborhood, with 60% having an unfavorable view of the March on Washington. But the truly heroic and persistent struggle of Black people in the face of dogs, water cannons, and police and Klan violence not only shifted public opinion, but also changed those participating and ultimately led them to more radical demands around the limits of integration for addressing racial as well as economic inequality. The leading organization of this period was without a doubt the Black Panthers. The Panthers were an explicitly socialist organization with a mass following. Their newspaper had a circulation of 100,000 copies per issue at its height. And they saw their role as raising people's consciousness, capturing this mass mood and organizing its vanguard. Most importantly, they saw the overthrow of capitalism as essential to the project of anti-racism. Today, there's a lot of focus on different community projects that the Panthers engaged in, like their free breakfast program or the fact that they carried guns. But I really like this quote from Eddie Conway, a former Panther, quote, "The state targeted the Panthers because we were socialists, not because we were armed." The most dangerous thing about the Panthers was that they had a mass audience and saw their project as linking up with different groups of oppressed peoples, whether they be Puerto Ricans or Chicanos or even poor whites. That is the context in which the Panthers and other wings of the movement were targeted for violent repression by the state and even murder. As Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor argues in From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, the backlash, quote, was intended not only to discipline rebelling African Americans, but to reestablish order in a society where demonstrations, illegal strikes, riots, and rebellions had become legitimate means of registering complaints against the state and forcing reforms from hostile political forces, including those of ordinary working class white people. More threatening still was the example set to movements from the anti-war movement to the struggle for women's liberation, which made the Black struggle, in Keeanga's words, a conduit for questioning American democracy and capitalism. So ultimately, rolling back the gains of this movement, including an expanded welfare state and instituting a neoliberal agenda, that is the upward transfer of wealth through privatization, austerity, and the gutting of what little social safety net we have, required attacking the most radical wing of this struggle. It required both racist attacks and attacks on explicit demands for socialism. We're really burying that history in a way. And this massive upward transfer of wealth required justification. Enter the racist myth of the Black welfare queen to justify the rollback of welfare reforms, obscuring the fact that the majority of people on welfare were white. Add to this the expansion of the carceral system and the criminalization of Black people, with the questions that the Black Power movement had begun to raise around racial and economic inequality left unresolved. But that expansion of the carceral system up until the present has meant far more poor and working class people of all races and genders are caught up in its web today. There are hundreds of white people killed annually by the police, and the fastest growing prison population is white women. That points to a basis for solidarity in fighting for abolition, but also to the importance of understanding that dismantling these systems requires fighting racism and the priorities of the ruling class in tandem. So I want to wrap up by summarizing that ultimately racism, as we've both argued, is an essential tool for maintaining inequality on a class basis. As Marx put it, in terms of fighting this, how do we get to a revolutionary consciousness? Marx says, quote, "Revolution is necessary not only because the ruling class cannot be overthrown in any other way, but also because the class overthrowing it can only in a revolution succeed in ridding itself of all the muck of ages and become fitted to found society anew." That is, struggle creates the context in which racist ideas and divisions can be broken down, but that is only a potential unless we actually fight for it. And organization is critical. Socialists should see our contribution as helping to cohere the experience and lessons of the militants, particularly of many Black activists who have become leaders in these struggles into lasting organizations, including our own. In this way, we can help lay the basis for stronger, more organized struggles that are better able to fight for and win our demands in the future, so especially the next time that the police kill a Black person or a city cuts social services while wasting billions of dollars on policing. But we also need to tie these struggles against racism in the here and now to the need for an entirely different society. Capitalism needs to divide our side in order to rule, and any of the reforms we win can be rolled back if and when they happen to conflict with the needs of the ruling class. We can see that in the Supreme Court's recent rolling back, putting the final nail in the coffin of affirmative action, the attacks on critical race theory, the very teaching of Black history, or rather of American history as it actually happened, and the emboldened far-right violence. All of that shows that progress isn't linear, and white supremacy is deeply rooted into every level of capitalist society. It's primed and ready to be mobilized when it's in the interests of the capitalist class. This is why our struggle needs to be for more than reforms. We need revolution. And I give the last word to Fred Hampton, who, as folks may know, was a Black Panther who was fighting for the unity under the Rainbow Coalition of all different groups in Chicago and was literally killed by this government for that. He said, quote, "We're going to fight racism, not with racism, but we're going to fight with solidarity. We say we're not going to fight capitalism with Black capitalism. We're going to fight it with socialism." Thank you, comrades.